for hosting us so nicely, and we're very happy to do this event here in the middle of the COP15, which is taking place maybe not just 2 kilometers away from here. So we are in the heart of the city, and of course we think that cities are important for this whole biodiversity debate, although at the COP, when you hear the talks about negotiations on how to basically prevent this dramatic decrease in biodiversity, it's more about the large spaces, marine, terrestrial spaces to protect species, or changes to forestry, fishery, agricultural practices that are not sustainable today. So it's more the big picture about our natural environments. And today our focus is different because cities are, of course, not the places where we have the most natural environment, but we do have some, and we're going to talk about it. But we are, of course, very responsible for this dramatic decline in biodiversity, because in more than half of humankind lives already in cities, and we've just turned 8 billion. So that's actually where it happens. I mean, cities consume resources, and even if you don't see it, this resource used and the way we deal with resource use and dumping waste on the planet, of course, affects biodiversity. So the way how we live in cities, how we exploit resources is extremely important for that question. So I would say we need to tackle these two aspects of course, how we deal with biodiversity in the city, because luckily we still have trees, we still have shrubs, we still have urban farms, we have gardens, backyards, and people do value these accesses to green spaces very much. So we need to talk about green in the city, but we also need to talk about the way we consume and the food we eat, the energy we consume, because all of this destroys biodiversity elsewhere. And so cities are very much part of this discussion. So I'm very happy that we talk about this here in the next 90 minutes with everybody online or in the space, and of course with our panelists. My name is Ursula Eicker. I'm running a Canada Excellence Research Chair on smart, sustainable and resilient cities and communities. And very early, or even earlier than I came in 2019, was my biology colleague Carly Zetter, who introduces herself.
Hi, yes, thanks Ursula for the introduction. So I am Carly Zetter, and I am an assistant professor here in the biology department at Concordia University. And with Ursula, with other colleagues across the university, I think about biodiversity and ecology in our cities. And particularly, something I want to pick up on from Ursula's introduction is that cities may not be where we have the most biodiversity, the most species, but it is where we have the most people. And so most people's interactions with nature, with biodiversity, with conservation actually start right here at home in our cities. And that's incredibly important for developing pro-environmental, sustainable conservation attitudes among the world's people. And in our lab, we really think about how our green spaces in the city can do two things: can protect biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, for conserving our insects, our birds, the species that are still living among us in our cities, passing through our cities. But we also think about how that biodiversity provides really critical benefits for people. So how do our urban forests cool our air, clean our air, reduce flooding, provide access to nature and recreation, all of these ecosystem services that we really rely on for livability, for our quality of life. And ideally, we want those two things to go together, right? We want our green spaces to work for people and for nature. So the talks that you'll hear from our students today will really touch on both of those aspects. So we're lucky to have 4 students with us today on our panel, 2 of them that you'll see sitting here, and 2 that will be kind of zooming in virtually that you'll see on the screen later. And so I will let Lingshan and Fatima introduce themselves. And then you'll hear from 2 additional students, Nicole Yu and Chloe Cull, later on the screen.
Okay.
Just introduce yourself. We're not finished with the introductions yet.
Okay, thank you, Carly. Well, hi everyone. My name is Lingshan Li. I'm the third-year PhD student from the Department of Geography in Concordia, but I'm also a member in the Next Generation Cities Institute and Design Life program. I have a background of remote sensing, GIS, and urban ecology. I'm working on the research to study the effect of spatial pattern of the green spaces on their ecosystem services, especially on the urban heat mitigation and air quality improvement.
Hello, everyone. This is Fatima. I'm Fatima Ismaili, and I'm a PhD student at Individualized Program at Concordia University. And I have background in urban design and architecture. And being a PhD student at an interdisciplinary program, I have chance to work in 3 reputable labs in Concordia University, CERC team supervised by Dr. Eicher, Ideas B lab supervised by Dr. Kukuzela, and Zetter lab supervised by Dr. Zetter. And I'm integrating the knowledge of urban ecology, engineering, as well as design to understand how built or green elements of the city can promote better walking and walkability. And thank you for...
Okay, thank you so much. Before we move into the event, I just wanted to share 2 facts with you that really impressed me lately. One I heard during a recent visit at the Weizmann Institute. They actually published a Nature article of showing that man-made mass has now exceeded the all living biomass on the planet. So it means buildings and infrastructure as the largest masses. They have now 1,100 gigatons, and that's more than all trees and shrubs that have 900 gigatons on the planet. So that's by far the largest number. Plastics, with 8 gigatons, we have more plastics, double the amount of weight of all animal species on the planet. I mean, if you imagine that, I mean, for me it's like, okay, we are really in the Anthropocene now. I mean, man really dominates the planet, mankind, not man. Mankind dominates the planet. I mean, and that was completely different 100 years ago when we were at 3%. I mean, human-made mass was 3% of all biomass, and we're basically now at the tipping point where we have overtaken nature, and you can imagine what kind of stress that puts on nature. So that's the one number, and the other number that quite impressed me is that we're still continuing to grow so much in our metropolitan areas. In Canada, in the last 20 years, there have been 1,700 square kilometers new built in the 9 biggest metropolitan areas. That's 3.5 times the island of Montreal built up again. So urban sprawl is still there, 35% in the last 20 years, and we still, and the density doesn't actually increase as fast. So the population growth is only 26%, so everybody consumes more and more space today. I think that's a big issue that we need to address. Okay, so for this event, what we aiming to do is to go into 4 presentations, starting with more the big picture on ecosystem services that Lingshan will talk about, and then
yeah, so from there, after we hear about ecosystem services and have a bit of a discussion, we will move into some research in parks within Montreal that is being done by Chloe Call in collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we're going to think a little bit about birds in our city from there.
And then we look at street level greenery and whether the way we plant or have green on the streets does affect walkability, and Fatima is going to talk about that.
And we'll end with some discussion of a concrete and ongoing greening project in the Sud-Ouest, which is the Grand Corridor Écologique du Sud-Ouest, which is an active attempt to increase our biodiversity in our city green spaces.
All right, so we have short presentations, and after every presentation we can enter a discussion on the podium with the audience, with you virtually. So for every block of these 4 presentations, we intend to spend about 15 minutes. But so don't overdraw too much your time. So Lingshan is going to start with the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Ecker. So can everyone see my screen? I don't know how to. Yeah. Okay. Well, the first page is about my self-introduction, as I have made before, but actually, I believe I forgot to introduce about my supervisors because most of them are right here today. Well, I'm going to introduce them again. I work with Dr. Ursula Ecker, Dr. Carly Zetter, and Dr. Angela Cross from a few different departments and working on my very disciplinary project. The urban greening and urban heat mitigation. And well, I will go with this agenda. First, I would like to introduce a little bit why is urban greening important, or why we need urban greening. And next, I would give a brief introduction of what I'm actually doing, talk a little bit about my research question, my objectives, and something. And then I would explain how do I conduct my study. Well, it's just very brief and simple. And at last, I would further illustrate how does my work improve the urban livability. First, why is urban greening important? Well, as we all know, the urbanization has greatly altered the physical surface in urban areas, which mainly include the increasing of the impervious surface and decreasing of green spaces. And these changes would lead to some temperature rise in urban areas, which is known as the urban heat island effect. And this rise of temperature would have some adverse impact on human health and human well-being. But we can use green spaces as some natural-based solutions to solve this kind of issues or just mitigate them. And the vegetation could cool the environment by mainly 2 ways. First, evapotranspiration. So the vegetation could transfer the sensible heat into the latent heat to cool the environment. And second, the shade effect. The vegetation, especially the trees, could intercept the solar radiation from the sun to the ground, so just cool the surface on the ground. And what am I actually doing? Well, all my research is mainly one to answer this question: how to better manage the green spaces in urban areas. Well, due to the limited spaces in the cities, we usually cannot build some large green spaces, like some huge parks. So it is very essential for us to think about how to manage like the urban trees, the shrubs, the lawns, and many other kind of green infrastructures. And for me, I focus on 2 aspects: the composition and configuration of the green spaces. The composition refers to the abundance and variety of those green infrastructure, and the configuration means the spatial arrangement or characteristics of them. And these 2 concepts would be combined into one main concept, the spatial pattern. And how do I conduct my study? Well, I mainly want to talk about the data set I would get. I would get the data mainly from two ways. First, from the remote sensing, which could provide me very consistent, repeatable, and large spatial scale data sets, and I could derive the land surface temperature from it. And second, the field measurement. I can get very accurate and high spatial temperature resolution data from it, like the air temperature data. And then I could do some statistic analysis to get a relationship between the spatial patterns and the ecosystem service they got. At last, how does my work improve the urban livability? Well, if we could better manage the limited green spaces in our city, we could get more cooling, and we could get the better air quality, and they would protect ourselves, especially those vulnerables. And well, that is all about my presentation. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to receive any questions or comments. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I don't know whether there's a room mic, if people, yeah, okay, there is. So if somebody in this space wants to ask questions, there is a mic. I would maybe ask a question. I mean, you didn't talk much about results, so but you did already some data analysis. Could you maybe tell us a bit of what we're talking about? What sort of range of temperature difference do you see between greener neighborhoods and less green neighborhoods?
Well, according to the results I see, the composition where the person cover of vegetation would take most effect, and like if we have higher person cover of trees, the grass, any kind of green space, green infrastructure, we could get maybe a few degrees cooler. Well, especially between like the inner city and the surrounding areas. And actually, we have also seen some effects by the configuration metrics, but it is not that significant as like the person cover of them. But we do see some. So I'm going to try to find more details in that. Yes, especially on the air temperature. Yeah, for the surface temperature, we could see some really significant differences. So that's my next step plan. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned like the composition of, like you were looking into the composition of the green spaces. Does like the variety of greenery have an effect on temperature, or is it just greenery in general is beneficial?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, in my research, I do classify the greenery into the high vegetation and the low vegetation. Well, the high vegetation means like the trees, some very high, yes, just its meaning is literally high vegetation, and the grass. Well, we do see the trees have more cooling effect than the grass because they could provide some shading effect. Yeah, but the grass could also reduce some land surface temperature. But for the air temperature, maybe we didn't see very significant results.
Yeah, and I can comment a little bit on that too from other projects we have going on in the lab looking at temperature. It depends as well on the time of day and the scale that you're looking at. And so often in the day, if you're outside during the day when it's really hot out, trees or high vegetation, as Lingshen was saying, usually gives us the greatest effect. So to really cool the city down on a hot day, we need those trees. But something that's starting to emerge from some of our newer research in Montreal is that at night, some of these, grassy or more kind of meadow areas that have lots of vegetation but lower can be really important for cooling at night, because there's not what can happen with trees is they can trap some of that heat that's kind of radiating out at night. And so you don't get as big of a difference, where these kind of open meadow types of spaces can be really important to reduce those nighttime temperatures further. And so what that's showing us is that it's important that we have a variety of different vegetation types. So we don't only want to plant one type of vegetation throughout the city. We want to make sure we have kind of a diversity of vegetation types so that we get those cooling benefits at different times of day and night throughout the city. But the most important thing is that it's green, really. It's the greening, as Lingshen was saying, that composition, the greenness itself is the big effect, and then the type and the arrangement is giving you, little bits of bumps here and there once it's green.
Can I ask a question to that? I mean, that would mean if we want kind of night cooling, I mean, where basically air can move into the city, we would need to well plan where the dominant winds would go, and that they would maybe pass via more open spaces to bring this night cooling into inner city areas. Because I think that's the interesting question of what all this means for the planning. So that my question would be, this would be one specific question for the night cooling effect. And yeah, maybe first that.
Sure, yeah, I can answer that, and then I think we had another question in the audience. I think we still need to learn more about how these measurements interact, with planning, with building patterns, with wind patterns, and that's a space where we've all kind of been working in our own silos, where the ecologists are going out and putting out sensors and measuring temperature in specific locations. The engineers are maybe modeling a specific built area or a specific street canyon, and making sure that we're all kind of sitting at the same table like we are right now, and designing studies that will tease that apart is really important, because we aren't necessarily taking those kind of wind patterns into account, I think, as much as we need to. But my sense is that yes, we do need some of these kinds of open green spaces as well, and that's where we see a lot of attention on tree planting, and tree planting is really, really important, but we have to make sure we recognize that other types of green spaces are also able to provide us benefits in the city.
Should I just hold it? Okay. So I have a question regarding the greenery and everything that you just presented. Are we specifically talking about high heat seasons, like during the summer, or does this greenery also have any sort of effect during the colder months? Because we're talking about Montreal and we're talking about Canada, and we have very cold, harsh climates, especially during winter, right? And if I'm not mistaken, during the winter, we do still have the urban heat island. If I'm not mistaken, during the winter, cities are still a little bit warmer or have higher temperatures. So I was wondering if it affects, in a way, the temperatures of, the sidewalks and all that during the winter.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Well, for my research, I only focus on the summer temperature because it is most significant to us, because in summer we got really extremely hot events, and relatively in winter maybe we don't pay that much attention on that. But yes, they do have some varieties between the seasons. And in winter we could see a lot of the trees and other vegetations, their leaves fall down, and that would have some effect on the final effect they provide. But it's a very meaningful question to have further study. Yeah.
Yeah, in the winter, the larger effect is probably from trees, conifer trees, for example. So evergreen trees that stay green all year round, and those trees can act as an important windbreak. And so particularly like around buildings or around homes, we can see very local effects of those trees, blocking wind or improving the microclimate for people. As Lingshan said, we haven't focused as much, not just we in this room, but like scientists in general haven't focused as much on the role of greenery in winter temperatures. We tend to focus in the summer when we have, those health impacts from high heat. But of course, in a winter city, it is important that we consider these things in the winter as well, and particularly their impact on things like energy budgets and heating costs, which link to this much bigger picture of climate change.
It's great. I mean, I see already a research project emerging on how to design green spaces so as, with all these different functions, shading, night ventilation, really urban type of wind flow to remove heat in summer. And also the winter effect on windbreaks. Most trees lose leaves, so they're not so much shading anymore in winter. That's quite nice of them. I have one final question to the sort of design of the city. The city of Montreal has promised to plant 500,000 trees, as far as I remember. Quite a big budget until 2030, so in the next few years, really. could we get some idea of where these trees should be planted? I mean, what did you see so far from your analysis? Are the trees pretty evenly spread to the city? Are there maybe some social, socioeconomic correlations between where the most trees are and where should they be planted? And do we have enough space for them?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yes, it's a good question. First, we need to consider our question or our the ambition of us. For example, the different configuration or composition, they take different effects at different spatial scale. And yes, if we want to, like, for example, build more clustered trees, they could provide more cooling at the local scale, but if they are very dispersed and they are evenly distributed in a large space, they could provide us the large regional scale cooling. So it depends on at which scale we want to get more cooling effect. And actually, for the socioeconomic perspective, we would like, yes, we could see some uneven distribution of these green spaces in Montreal, and like the ethnic minorities and the low-income families, they usually live in a place with less vegetation. So we need to think how could we plant more trees in that region to help improve the environmental justice, yes, and help those vulnerables. Yes, it still needs further study on the distribution and the disparities.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important, that Montreal has a particularly inequitable distribution of trees. And so if we look at a map of trees in Montreal, in many ways is a map of wealth in Montreal. And we see these stark disparities between who has access to nature, who has access to cooling, and who doesn't. And as we think about planting these, hundreds of thousands of new trees in the city, we need to be thinking about not just where will they provide the most kind of absolute cooling effect, but where will they allow people to access that benefit as well.
Yeah, I looked up some numbers that in the town of Mont Royal, with the median income of 110,000, has a 40% canopy cover, and in Hochelaga, with a median income of $40,000, just 11%. More or less linear correlation. Okay, so we need to do something about it. I would say we move now to the next topic. Thank you, Lingshang, and Kali is going to introduce the speaker.
Yeah, so next, can you pull up Chloe's talk for us, Fatima? So next we're going to watch a pre-recorded presentation from Chloe Call, who is a new master's student who just started a few months ago. And we're launching a new project with colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and particularly Dr. Barbara Fry, who's a research scientist working on urban nature-based climate solutions and thinking about how our cities can be spaces that both provide access to green space for people.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe.
And she's taken over. So Chloe's going to talk to you in a minute about how we can, how we're learning about how green spaces can provide space for people to use and recreate, but also be good habitat for our urban biodiversity. And in particular, we're looking at birds.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe, and today I'm going to be talking about urban birds and the research project that I'm just starting. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, my research, why I'm interested in carrying out this research, and how I plan to carry it out. So I am a first-year master's student at Concordia University in the biology department. I've just started this fall, so I'm only starting to figure out the details of my project now. I am very grateful to be co-supervised by Dr. Carly Zetter, who is here today, and by Dr. Barbara Fry, who is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. But enough about me. I know you are here for the birds, so I will be getting to that shortly. To start, as you are all aware, today is about greening our cities and about the connections that humans have with nature. Urban green spaces that we manage and plan for might be the only area where urban residents have access to nature, which is so important. But of course, we aren't the only ones that benefit from green spaces. Wildlife need them too. Urban green spaces provide refuge for a variety of wildlife, such as birds. I'm particularly interested in birds because they are, from my experience, some of the main wildlife that you can encounter in cities. Even from my tiny back courtyard, I can still watch birds. People have always been interested in birds. Even those that don't know much about their biology or ecology can tell you exactly what species they are hearing just based on knowing the bird's song. Especially over COVID-19, when we've all had to find new ways of keeping busy, more and more people have become interested in birds and bird watching. Birds have also historically been used as indicators of biodiversity and overall ecosystem functioning because they are so abundant and also very sensitive to changes in the environment around them. But sadly, Canada's birds are on the decline. We currently have 91 species of birds that are listed as being at risk of population declines and or extinction in our country. Some are experiencing more threats to survival than others, but the main threat to birds here is habitat loss and or degradation. As our cities continue to expand, we are losing a lot of valuable forested land, which is where birds are most diverse and healthy. This is where urban green spaces come in. Knowing the risk that cities can pose to birds and knowing the benefits that humans can get from interacting with nature and birds, we need to think about ways that we can meet the needs of both birds and people when planning and managing our green spaces. We need to balance the two. The research that I will be doing fits into this whole puzzle. While there has been work done on the impact that humans have on bird species richness and abundance in urban areas, to my knowledge, there is currently a gap in the literature on how bird success is impacted by people. Some work has involved looking at how the distance between a nesting site and a road or a trail impacts the success of the nest at producing viable, healthy chicks. But what is missing is how trail use and how the density of trails within a green space impacts nest success. So that is exactly what I would like to do. I plan on asking this question: what are the effects of human disturbance, quantified by trail use and trail density of a green space, on bird nesting success? Where success from my project would be any nest that produces one hatched and successfully fledged bird. To do so, I plan on looking at comparing urban green spaces that have higher use and lower use. I am going to count the trail users by using a sensor, and I will also use maps to determine the trail density of different sites. I am then going to find nests and monitor them throughout the nesting season, starting in April. I will compare the success of nests between these high and lower use parks and look at whether trail use and trail density might have an impact on bird nesting success. So let's take a step back here. I've told you broadly that I'm interested in studying the human use of green space and how this can impact bird nesting success, and I've given a quick snapshot at how I'm going to do this. But let me tell you why this is so important. Going back to the idea of balancing human use of green spaces, it is crucial that we figure out the impact of humans on bird nesting, or perhaps the lack of an impact. If my research finds that the number of trail users and the density of trails does have an impact on bird nesting success, then maybe managers should focus on protecting areas of green space solely for birds and minimizing the number of trails. Or perhaps my findings will be that these factors do not have an impact on bird nesting success. Either way, it will be interesting to see these results, and it can help to inform managers and conservationists. Through my project, I will also be collecting data on the number of trail users in some of the Island of Montreal's parks. This data could be useful to different sectors of the government to see just how many people are using their green spaces. And lastly, my work can maybe help to provide a bit of context or help answer the question of how to plan parks in order to maximize biodiversity with the recreational use and access of green spaces to all people. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I know I'm doing this remote, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I've had to say. And if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to me via email. I'm happy to field any questions or concerns. Thank you.
All right, so Chloe unfortunately was hoping to be with us today, but she is driving east to try and avoid a snowstorm before she goes to visit her family for the holidays. But I am happy to field questions kind of on behalf of Chloe, as well as on this kind of broader area of research on how we balance green spaces for people and nature, or other ways we're thinking about bird diversity and park use in a Canadian context. We have a question over here in the audience.
How are you guys measuring, or like when you're comparing multiple green spaces to like the composition of it, like if there's like natural waterways, and like how are you ensuring, like how are you doing it so the results aren't impacted by these external sources? Like,
yeah, so how do we compare different spaces? That's a great question, and something that we think about a lot in our research, because there are multiple other things that could be influencing any of these factors that we're measuring. And so when we're designing kind of field work like this, where someone is actually going to go out and take measurements, we try and find areas that are as comparable as possible other than the thing that we are trying to measure. And so we would select sites so that they have similar types and amount of green space, similar, distance to water or tree composition or other factors, but that really differ in their amount of use or their amount of trails, so that we could really isolate the factor that we're most interested in studying, and kind of avoiding or putting aside not avoiding, we're kind of controlling for some of these other factors that we know will have an impact on bird biodiversity or bird success.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, if I was thinking about parks is one thing, but if we think of sort of smaller green spaces in cities and we want birds, I mean, how much is that studied? Because surely if you have a sort of small park in a street corner, there will always be probably a lot of movement and people movement around, so not even talking about trails, which already suggest relatively undisturbed space. So do we know what kind of the minimum area is you would need to get some birds to nest and successfully hatch?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that my colleagues at ECCC could answer better, who are the ornithologists in the project. But in general, birds will, it depends what aspect of success you're looking at. So if you're looking at, can a space successfully, can birds successfully reproduce in that space? Can they actually build nests and use that as habitat? You are looking at often a larger green space and often a more forested green space, depending on the type of bird, of course. Where a lot of these, small neighborhood parks are probably not spaces birds are going to choose to, build a nest and reproduce. But that doesn't mean they're not important for providing resources in some other way. And so providing areas for birds to, forage, or for birds to stop over on their way to somewhere else. And so there is interesting research showing that for migratory birds, they are actually attracted to, city lights. And so they'll be drawn to urban areas and then need to find a space to stop over on their journey. And so making sure that we have green spaces that birds can stop and refuel and take off again is another aspect that we think about. It's not only about nest success. One of the important things that we can do in small green spaces, like corner parks or your own backyard, is thinking about what kinds of plants we're planting. And so making sure that we're planting species that are good food sources for birds. And often this means focusing on native trees and shrubs. And so we know that native trees and shrubs, ones that are indigenous to this area, tend to support more insects, and that tends to support more birds because that's basically providing bird food. So if you can provide a tree that's going to attract caterpillars, that's then going to attract birds. And so thinking about when we're making our planting decisions at our homes or our businesses or our streets, choosing these native species that are going to be able to support those birds is a really important piece of the puzzle.
All right. Okay, more questions?
Do you guys only focus on like plant biodiversity, or do you guys look into just like water habitats too that would like be historically there?
Yeah, so in this specific project, we're focusing more on forested birds. A lot of our work right now with Environment and Climate Change Canada is really driven by policies that are in the works right now. For example, things like Canada's 2 Billion Trees program, where we're planting trees across the country, or the I'm going to say this wrong, Nature Smart Green Infrastructure Program. And these are often focused around greening and planting in kind of terrestrial environments. And so we're really looking at, as we roll out these programs, as we add plants to our environment, how do we do this in a way that is good for species, good for biodiversity? There is certainly a lot of other research, outside of our lab that's looking specifically at waterways and looking at the importance of water for birds. Particularly important are areas like wetlands. And so if we think about one of the kind of birding hotspots in Montreal, it would be the Techno Park, which is near the Montreal airport, which is a historically a wetland habitat. And so making sure that when we're protecting green spaces, we are protecting those wetlands and those water features, that has a big effect.
Okay. Thank you. I think we can move to the next topic. It's now up to Fatima to present her work on street level greenery and walkability. Please.
Hello again. I don't want to go through the detail about myself because I introduced myself now. Just about my my topic, I should say that it is towards comfortable, walkable, and green streets. And I will work on walkability assessment method with the focus of on street level greenery and thermal comfort. During this presentation, I will talk about first a little about my research and why I chose to study urban green and thermal comfort. And then I will talk a little about my, my methodology. And then I will say about the contribution of my research to livability. Sorry. What is my research about? My research tends to define a new method to assess walkability, and I will focus on thermal comfort and green street level greenery, and because I found some gaps in literature review, and I saw that there is no study that combine this all together in the same time. Why street level greenery, thermal comfort, and walkability? First, what is walkability? Walkability is a concept that has become very important in urban design, urban planning, and transportation. And in fact, this is a concept that refers to how and to what extent the built environment encourages people to walk. But walkable streets has some characteristics such as high density of building, land use diversity, more connected streets, and sidewalk present, which are associated with increase the overall impervious surfaces and decrease in the area of vegetation cover, which led to environmental pollution, increase the temperature along the street, and decrease the attractiveness. So there is worry that the benefit of walkability, I mean high walkability estate or neighborhoods, such as improving walking behavior and also improving health, and as well as I mean the social interaction and community building might be might be affected by any worse impact of walkable streets. Now, one of the mitigation strategies is adding a street level greenery. And it's not also it's add visual quality to the streets, but it also decrease the surrounding temperature. It minimizes the amount of solar radiation and improve human comfort in weather, and also it will increase the walking rates. How I am doing that? About the methodology, I should say that I started with some literature review on the existing methodologies for assessing walkability in urban areas. Then I am comparing and optimizing different street level greenery measurement method. I will identify and validate a workflow for outdoor thermal comfort simulation. Mixing these three together, I will link street level greenery and thermal comfort with walkability, and I will develop an innovative walkability measurement tool and walkability index. As a part of my study, now I'm comparing different methods of urban greenery measurement. As you can see here, it is done in 3 levels. First, top-down view. As you see in the corner of the picture, I am using satellite images to measure in the urban greenery. And most empirical studies have used this method, but unfortunately, this overlooked some forms of greenery, such as green walls or flower boxes or any other greenery that is existing under bridges. The second view is bird view using remote sensing methods, and the third view is pedestrian eye view using Google Street Images, and I'm in fact doing some image segmentation to measure greenery. And this is the actual view that people have, and how people exposure to the greenery while they are walking and how they perceive greenery. If I want to talk about the contribution of my study to the livability, I should say that walkability not also improve walking behavior and improve the accessibility of people to their essential amenities. It also improve the social interaction. It also help to improve the community building, as well as some health promotion. So the main mission of us in NGCI is to help to create a city where people and nature are more connected, a city where we all enjoy high quality green space with the clean air to breathe. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. Just a short question. Is there any evidence that this street level greenery increases walkability, or do people not rather walk towards something, towards a park or towards a shop or so?
Yeah, there are some recent studies that they focus on street level greenery because they believe that now that the destination, not just destination, is important, but the way that you go to that destination is very essential. So they found some positive correlation between the street level greenery and walking behavior. Also, not also odds of walking, but also the walking time and walking distance.
I mean, that I can very well imagine, because I think that's actually one of the major problems with these routing mechanisms like Google Map offers for cycling and walking. Often they take you along horrible streets where you don't want to walk or cycle. I think we should enter a cooperation with Google on that, of saying, because sometimes you don't care whether it takes 5 minutes more, but you want the suggestion of a nice green route. And I don't understand why they don't do it, because they, as you said, I mean, they've got the imaging, they could do some image processing, they could probably do it reasonably easy, but I don't know why they don't.
Yeah, and also about the thermal comfort, they can say that in a hot event, which distance is more cooler.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if the same way you can click like avoid highways, you could also click like avoid heat waves, or like avoid, you know, concrete, or have these routes where it's like maybe it's 3 minutes longer, but it's much more pleasant along the way.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question about the thermal comfort aspect of your research, particularly on how you define thermal comfort when it comes to streets and sidewalks. Because within buildings, we already have this discussion of what really thermal comfort is, right? We have different groups of people who have different sensitivity levels, different rates of metabolism. Then we have, of course, the outside temperature and all of these things that affect it. And then we have a lot of research putting sensors here and there to see occupant comfort, etc. So how do you define thermal comfort when it comes to sidewalks?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Outdoor thermal comfort, there are 4 variables that affect outdoor thermal comfort. One is humidity, the second one is wind, air temperature, and mean radiant temperature. And we will consider these 4 variables to measure outdoor thermal comfort. And I am going to do some simulation to measure the outdoor thermal comfort.
Just one more question to how are these 4 factors that you mentioned weighted? What counts more? Because I think that's also in indoor studies, there's always a question how much weighs the air temperature versus mean radiant temperature, what's more important, and usually the simplest models always say 50-50, but that's not always true. So can you give us an indication how much humidity counts compared to the temperature or wind effects?
You mean in outdoor thermal comfort, what mean radiant temperature is more important and more significant effect? And they, in a recent study, I saw that most study just focus on mean radiant temperature. But it depends on, I think it depends on the climate. Maybe the humidity in some countries has significant effect than the mean radiant temperature, or vice versa in other cities.
Are you also looking at how like greenery on streets affects like the speed of traffic and how that increases walkability? Or are you just focusing on like the temperature and walkability aspect?
In my study, I'm just focusing on pedestrian and how it can affect on people when they are walking, no matter if it is a leisure walking or it is somehow transportation walking.
I think that's a really interesting point, that there is this relationship sometimes between, traffic calming and greening, where often in cities we'll use traffic calming as kind of a way to get greenery into our streets. And so if you think about, bump outs at stop signs or the end of curbs, those are places where we can then add greenery at the same time as kind of reducing traffic and making them more pedestrian friendly. And so it might not always be easy to fully tease apart those two factors. Okay, I think we're going to move on to our final short presentation. Oh, no, we have a question at the back.
No, take the microphone because it's recorded. Otherwise,
The people on Zoom want to
Oh,
hear your
okay,
question
okay.
as well.
Are you evaluating, because I speak so strong, not strong, but high. Are you evaluating how people, pedestrian, when it's green, are the happiness and less stress?
It's a good question. It is a good question that people in health, studies are doing that, and they are evaluating the effect of urban greenery on many different diseases, such as stress, some mental disease, or some physical disease as well. But for my study, no, I didn't focus on that. Thank you.
but we're actually working on a virtual tool of building a neighborhood basically in a computer model, but that you can either watch on screen, but also in a headset, so that it's a bit more realistic when you walk around the neighborhood. And we want to use that tool exactly for that question of, because it's very hard to quantify happiness, and because it's very subjective, people react to totally different things. But I think the goal of our neighborhood sort of kind of game is to say, let's people walk around and they score. They tell us, okay, so then we give different scenarios, more or less trees or so, and they say, okay, I like that, or I don't care. I mean, I basically want to get to the next coffee shop or so. So it's exactly, the game is designed to have a day in the life. You can choose your personality, you have sort of 5 tasks to do, and then you score. And I think we aim to find out what people really like, because we have so many debates in the city of what density is actually acceptable, how high should we build. I mean, it's pretty subjective, and usually there are not sort of huge surveys done before a neighborhood gets changed. So and I think we want to use that kind of tool to find out what people really think and feel. It's all very emotional in parts, so hard to quantify. And I think the best is if you have people saying directly what they like, and creating these kind of virtual environments to make it as realistic as possible, and collect opinions to then inform policy decisions.
And can I add something? This question was in my mind while I started this study. Is it the visual quality that people tend to go in a way that there are more greenery, or it is just thermal comfort and comfort? But we should do some questionnaire and ask people who choose this way, and ask them if they go there because of some aesthetics, or maybe they prefer to go in a cooler way or cooler streets.
And this is a really interesting question when we're thinking about kind of biodiversity in general. If you're a biologist or a biodiversity scientist, we tend to think of, okay, how many species are there, or what traits do those species have? But of course, that's not how most people go about thinking about their daily life, right? You might be thinking of, does this look pretty? Or do I see a lot of colors? Or do I hear a lot of sounds? And so something that we're thinking more about, working with social scientists and other disciplines is how do we quantify biodiversity in ways that's really, you know, more relevant for most people. You know, when we're thinking about what kinds of trees are you planting at your home or your business, you're probably not making those decisions based on, you know, the species of that tree so much as does it look interesting, does it have nice colors, does it have fruits? And so what are the traits that we can use to connect with people and still make sure that we have more biodiversity in our cities?
Sorry, I hope I'm not taking too much time, but this is just a short question. So you're talking about walkability and like sidewalks. So are we talking about the greenery just on the sidewalks? Because on one of the images there was also like vertical greenery, like green walls and all. And when we talk about green walls, it's the building. So then that goes into the private sphere. So I was wondering if your research also looks into that, or is it more just what the sidewalk entails?
Yeah, thank you. What I want to measure is street level greenery and in eye level, you know, what people see while they are walking. And using Google Images, I can do some image segmentation and measure the green pixels of each images from each point along the street. And so it can be such as green walls or some flower boxes from some facades or something, I mean some small patches in the corner of the streets.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to our last student talk. And so the last speaker is going to be Nicole Yu, who is another new master's student who is currently on a plane to Hong Kong. And so she's going to come to us virtually as well. And she's working on a project with the Sud-Ouest Arrondissement as well as the NGO Nouveaux Voisins to study a new biodiversity corridor in Montreal.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole, a first-year Master's of Biology student supervised by Dr. Carly Zetter. My project is about connecting urban biodiversity with ecological corridors. Today's theme is about livable cities, but we often forget about the non-human organisms of cities. Hi everyone, I'm Nicole, a first-year Master's of Biology student supervised by Dr. Carly Zetter. My project is about connecting urban biodiversity with ecological corridors. Today's theme is about livable cities, but we often forget about the non-human organisms of cities. Whether we like it or not, there is a lot of urban biodiversity that also share the space. Sometimes they get on our nerves, like the groundhog that eats all of Carly's expensive native plants. But they each play important roles like mechanical parts in a machine. In particular, arthropods such as insects and spiders make up more than 80% of the world's animal biodiversity, many of which are common urban dwellers. And we may already be familiar with how we need bees for pollination and ladybugs that eat the pests in your garden. But wasps and spiders are also efficient and important predators, whilst many other insects are crucial food sources for other urban animals such as birds. They bring many ecosystem services, which are nature's benefits for humans, to cities. Unfortunately, cities are not easy habitats to live in. Habitat sizes are smaller depending on how fragmented green spaces are, and there are barriers such as roads and buildings that make moving around hard. The green spaces that we do have are mowed lawns, which removes animals that lay eggs or live in the longer grasses and plants. And so we need ways to improve urban biodiversity. And one way is to build ecological corridors, which is a single or a series of green spaces that connect existing habitats, so animals can move more easily throughout the city and access more resources. In the Sud-Ouest Arrondissement, there is an ongoing ecological corridor project that results from the Montreal participatory budget. It was designed by Nouveaux Voisins, which is a nonprofit that works on improving city greening to increase urban biodiversity. Part of the project includes planting biodiversity plots, or gardens, in parks along the aqueduct that were previously mainly trees and grass. These biodiversity plots increase the complexity of the habitat, potentially creating more habitats for urban arthropods. And apart from these design plots, there are also areas that won't be mowed, just to let the grass grow. And this is where my project comes in, as we need to assess and evaluate whether these solutions are effective in increasing biodiversity. And so my research will work on uncovering what arthropod biodiversity is in the corridors and how effective are different management methods in the Sud-West corridor to foster biodiversity. So in the spring and summer of 2023, I will be sampling the arthropods that are in these areas, identify them, and try to see how much and what kinds of biodiversity are supported in each of these different areas. This project also aims to foster connection of residents of the arrondissement to nature. And so some of the surveying may involve citizen science, where members of the public can participate and help to collect data, and also be encouraged to approach urban biodiversity. So stay tuned if the opportunity to observe nature and contribute to science sounds interesting to you. Overall, this project will help us to understand how arthropods use the design biodiversity plots and also the aqueduct vegetation. And so we'll know what designs work for improving biodiversity and urban connectivity and advise how we manage urban green spaces. And with this information, we can expand the methods that were successful in creating habitats and apply them to other urban parks and green spaces. So thank you for listening to my sharing, and for more information and updates for our work, whether for recruiting helpers on these projects or resources on what to plant in your garden to help urban biodiversity, you can check out our lab website and stay tuned for our activities.
All right, so I can put on my Nicole hat now and try and answer questions about Nicole's project as well. And then from there, if there's, once we're done with questions specific to this work, I think we can broaden to a discussion about kind of everything we've presented here today or other questions that you may still have for us.
Okay, maybe I start with the question. I mean, what we've seen in the picture on connecting two big forests, basically, that seems very obvious that animals want to move from one side to the other. But if you look at the island of Montreal, it's much more fragmented. I mean, can you maybe explain a bit what a corridor really means? If you just have a park here and there, a bit of street green, I mean, you probably need to cross the street, or an animal needs to cross the street at some point. Or is it really connected green spaces, or can there be interruptions? How would you define a corridor?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there are different ways of thinking about corridors. So some of it is, physical connectivity like you'd see with a wildlife bridge or something going across a road. Other ways of thinking about corridors are more like stepping stones. And so species may still need to, get across a road or get over a barrier, but at least they have spaces kind of along the way. And so a lot of the corridors that the city is working on several kind of what they call ecological corridors on the island, and often these are about maximizing the habitat in the green spaces we already have. And so if we have, I'll back up a little bit. When we're thinking about green space and biodiversity in cities, there's two things that are really important. One is actually having more green space. So like building new parks, planting, new areas, converting kind of gray infrastructure to green. That's really hard to do. We do that sometimes, but often, once you've built, it's really hard to go backwards. The other thing that we can do is making sure the green spaces we do have are actually like working hard for us and doing what they can to protect biodiversity. So rather than just having a park that is like a lawn and that's it, which doesn't really do very much for biodiversity, can we increase more habitat into those spaces that exist? And so this corridor project, as well as others, is taking green spaces that exist, but then deliberately introducing what they call kind of biodiversity islands, or essentially pollinator gardens or similar, into these habitats. So in the Sud-West, they're putting in, I think, approximately 200 of these individual kind of garden stepping stones that hopefully will do much more for species than just having like mowed grass in those spaces. And so it's a corridor in the sense that it's providing kind of patches of habitat throughout an area, but there are still these barriers in the city like roads and paths that unfortunately, as much as I would love to go in and take out all the roads, people tell me that's not practical to do.
So I have a question regarding the corridors, because just like Dr. Eicher said, it's like we saw in the picture, you know, a highway, and then there's just two large patches of green around it, and then there's a straight line, so it looks like a bridge. But how do we really come to the conclusion that that's the optimal design? Because if, for example, we look at urban places where people don't live anymore and then nature starts to reclaim it, the pattern in which nature generally starts to reclaim things is different than a straight line. So how do we make sure that, okay, we built this corridor and the biodiversity of the animals, the insects, whatever, they're going to actually cross it?
Yeah, so in this case, I mean, that bridge was not a Montreal example. And so that's kind of just an example to illustrate a wildlife corridor in general. There is a huge amount of work going into those kinds of wildlife bridges and whether and how they work. And typically they do work. Usually that's also done in combination with things like fencing and other mechanisms that make sure animals actually get to that space. So we're not just like putting a bridge in and assuming all the moose will find it. In the city, one of the things that is going on in these kinds of corridors is we're trying different things. So in this corridor in the Sud-Ouest, they have at least 4 different types of garden. And so there are smaller gardens that are kind of, I think they're 10 meters squared, you know, kind of like the size of this table, small patches that have mostly flowers. There are larger gardens that have shrubs and flowers, and there are even larger ones that are like a mini forest plot. And then we have these areas that we've just kind of stopped mowing and said, okay, let's let what's there come back and see, you know, this kind of cheap and easy solution to see if that works. And these are distributed throughout these different parks. And so one of the things we'll be doing is comparing, you know, which ones of these actually do work better for different kinds of biodiversity. Are they using certain habitats more than others? We're also trying different combinations of plants. When we go in and plant these gardens, Nouveau Voisins has designed different arrangements of plants that might work better or worse. And so at the end of this, we'll hopefully be able to say, you know, okay, this worked really well, this didn't work so well. So if we expand this to another borough, let's do it more like this. Maybe it's just that we need to stop mowing the grass and let things come back, and that works just as well as these kind of time and money intensive interventions. Now, does that look as nice, or do people like it as much? Probably not. And so again, you're kind of balancing people's perceptions with what works for the species. But some of this in cities is really still kind of trial and error, figuring out, you know, what do species like, what do they use, what can we reasonably do within the constraints of the space and time and money we have. But you're right, we can't just put like a straight line of something and assume that will protect all the species. However, what we tend to do right now is say, okay, we have a green space, and then we take non-native grass and mow it to an inch and then put a few shrubs and assume that that's going to protect biodiversity, which we know doesn't work very well. And so we're seeing, you know, what can we add within reason that might work better for these species? And which species does it work for? So you may be able to protect some things and not others with these different strategies.
I just wanted to comment on and have a question about when the balancing, you know, the rewilding versus, like, you know, people's perceptions of them, and how, like, is there any research and like data, like statistical data on, you know, like what people are thinking about, you know, these rewilded spaces? Because as far as I understand it, at least my experience in Hochelaga, something that's very, very, very important to the neighborhood is the Tachenweg. And I don't know, I was just wondering, like, you know, and I think it's overwhelmingly well perceived, you know. I'm just curious, you know, what data might be about.
That's a great question, people's perception of these spaces, and that perception really varies. And so we do have multiple cases in Montreal of areas, you know, like the Tachenweg in Hochelaga, like the Technopark, like the Falaise Saint-Jacques or the Champ de Possible, where there are these kind of informal green spaces that are not officially protected, that aren't parks, that communities have kind of adopted and really love and care for and protect and value incredibly highly. Now there are other people that would look at that terrain vague and say, well, this is just a bunch of weeds, and what are we doing? Why don't we put a nice bench here and mow this area? And so it is really variable. In general, we know that education is really important. So educating people that, what are the species we're protecting? What are the benefits of this space? And another thing that's really important is something that we often call like cues to care in the literature. So something that's like a signal that this space is loved and valued. So that could be like signage. It could be that you've mowed, a path or a border, or you have some signal that like we didn't just this isn't just like abandoned and let go. This is purposely, left this way because of the benefits it brings to people and to nature. Anecdotally, if you talk to people who work in the city who have tried to leave some of these areas unmowed or kind of rewild some areas, you will get calls from citizens who say, well, they haven't mowed the park, it looks messy, it looks weedy, what are you doing? And so having that education paired with these initiatives is really important, and that's something they're thinking really hard about in the Sud-West corridor, is how can we use signage, how can we use citizen science and activities and kind of sensibilisation to make sure that people are aware of the values of these kinds of initiatives. And certainly that's going to vary depending on the community as well. But I do think that kind of awareness of the importance of these spaces and the value of these spaces is growing. I certainly see that in terms of the number of groups that have formed in Montreal of concerned citizens who are working, actively working very hard to protect these spaces that maybe have been kind of overlooked or ignored in the past. And so I think we're starting to see the benefit of some of this kind of rewilding, but I think we have to be careful about how we introduce it in spaces that had a previous kind of particular aesthetic or like a manicured look to them that people may not want to lose.
All right, I want to use the opportunity to bring my friend and colleague Nathalie Volant on the stage because we have a real estate developer here with us who's very interested in sustainability and does a lot of projects in Montreal and talks to a lot of people in Montreal. So I would really like to use the occasion to ask her what is the developer's perspective on this debate on biodiversity. After all, you're building maybe new projects or retrofitting old ones. Does it actually play a role, this topic of biodiversity, or is it not relevant for the private sector today in the city?
We're putting Natalie on the spot here, so thank you.
Hi. I'm also doing my PhD with Dr. Eicher, so I have to say yes when she asks me to do stuff. Yes, so I'm a real estate developer in Montreal, actually in the Sud-West, so I would love to do this biodiversity plot, by the way, just hang out. For us, the new projects that we're building are in different areas of Quebec, and what's been shocking to us is when we go into a new area, developers think that the best use of land space is concrete or sidewalks and very little grass, forget mowing because they don't want to mow the grass, not because of biodiversity. They just literally put pavers, which if we were talking about the heat island, that's something that we would like to study to be able to figure it out. So we're going into an area of Quebec which is new, meaning that it's new for humans. And it's shocking that there's 0 trees, like none. And a lot of developers feel like if you're moving into a virgin land, that the easiest and best thing is to just take all the trees down. And like you were saying, as far as quality of space, those mature trees are actually creating much higher values for real estate developers. So when you plant crappy, tiny little non-expensive trees that will take 30 years to grow, the negative equity that you have for the new clients coming in, never mind how people feel in the environments. So I didn't actually think a lot about biodiversity when we were looking at the new projects at first. And when I went to go onto the sites, It was shocking to me how there was just nothing. And so we actually built the park areas before we even designed the buildings. And we designed the buildings around nature. And what was cool about that, and what we're starting to study and what we'll be working with Next Gen, is to figure out, first of all, we immediately refused to have any on-site parking. It's all going to be underground, even though it's more expensive. But we've been able to negotiate with the city to build a little bit higher so that we can create those densities and buildable square footage as needed. But by removing the asphalt, as an example, we're even doing something as crazy as, like, you know, you become a tenant in the new space and you get your, like, your urban agriculture plot, and you get a tree. You know, and those trees actually, it's funny you mentioned about colors, sound. We actually have like a grid that we gave to the architects and the engineers, and we're like, if you can't see, smell, or feel it, we don't want it. Which is funny, and they all look at you like you're a crazy person, which is fine. Totally happy to be a crazy person. So now a lot of our investors and the banks that we work with, they want to be able to quantify what that means. So for us, a lot of it is like gut reaction. But for the biodiversity, maybe just to finish on that, what I'm trying to show is that it's not more expensive. So I'm literally taking the landscaping budget that people have already on the documents, and what we're doing is, can you do something better with it? Like, I've literally outlawed grass, so I feel a lot better about what you're saying. But what I've been able to do is, by not having grass, I don't have to run the sprinkler systems. So I'm also taking the budget of the sprinkler systems, and I'm putting it back into biodiversity. So it gives me a little bit better of a budget. So it's not perfect, but it's certainly better, and what we want to do is be able to measure it.
Measure what?
What are the reduced heating and cooling costs associated to air quality, something that we're really interested about, because now, especially after COVID, people want to know that air quality is possibly affected. And I'm talking about specifically on the outside. Yes, I would love to be able to measure quality of life issues, but I find that I haven't yet found the metrics. So if you guys figure it out, I'm super happy to use our properties as something that you can test on. I think it's very difficult to measure happiness. I measure happiness by buildings being full, by people renewing leases. It's not as sexy as that opportunity, but if people are happy somewhere, they stay. So it's hard to quantify a qualitative situation. So we're just trying to be able to show developers, including our own investors and stuff like that, that our buildings will be full longer, quicker, that there's less turnover costs, and hopefully the turnover cost that is associated to an average building, maybe what we can do is put that in the budget from the beginning and be like, okay, well, now I've got 10% more of something because I can fill my spaces more and quicker. So in the end, it's just, can we change the business plan in a way that makes a lot more financial sense? But what we're doing is, usually when you calculate your ROI for real estate, you're not calculating all those things. So can we expand those parameters a little bit more and be like, well, there are usually a 10% carrying cost for empty spaces. If I can fill those up a lot faster, can I take some of that budget and do something else with it? Right. Including our new concept in our new project is bring back the birds. So I'm super excited to talk about the persons on here. But
well, we can talk about birds later for sure. But yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you're bringing up about cost, where I think often it's seen as, oh, it's going to be so expensive to rewild this space, but you're not thinking about, well, if you're mowing, if you're maintaining pavement, if you're watering, if you're doing all of these ongoing things, can you design a landscape up front that takes less maintenance, that is going to be more sustainable long term, and reduce some of those costs later? Not to mention costs in terms of, heating, cooling, all of these other benefits you're getting from biodiversity. And it's often landscaping, it tends to be, I think, kind of a leftover thing in a lot of plans or development, where it's like, let's get the building right, and then we'll plant some shrubs. And it's nice to see that changing, where it's like, well, these outdoor spaces are actually also a critical part, of the design of a project as well. And some of that might be, leaving the trees that were there to begin with.
That's a question.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in that there is a question online. Kimia, go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I have a general question. I'm a master's student at Concordia, and I'm a research. I'm working with building and construction, and how can I engage people more to purpose of paperless during the project. And also I'm using mixed reality and Microsoft HoloLens to use less paper. And I'm really also into working with greenery things and sustainable, but I'm not sure if is there any possibility during the construction and to do it.
So the question is about construction, about how we can integrate greenery during the construction process, or?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I mean, I think what Natalie was just presenting is relevant there, whereas we're planning new developments or new construction processes, thinking about where will green space or biodiversity be integrated in that design. And so is there a budget? Is there kind of intentionality for how you will integrate plants or green space, or is that kind of an afterthought? I'm not sure. The first part of your question, I think, was more about paper, and I'm not sure I have an answer to that part myself.
No, I don't have an answer neither. It was not very clear what exactly the question was aiming at. Anyway, but you can write us an email, because we are at the end of time of our workshop. I think there have been a lot of interesting points raised, and what we just touched at the beginning. I mean, this value of ecosystem services. I mean, if we plant tree, or if we create these spaces, it costs money to do it and to maintain, but I haven't seen much on actually the value it brings, because we tend to quantify everything, but if you say, okay, this reduces health costs by 10%, where does it appear in the budget? And I think we need to move much more. We are in this system, capitalist system, where everything is translated into money, and while we live with that, we should sort of push of giving explicit value to some of these services, and make maybe the banks understand that that can be taken into account. And I think that's a really interesting line of work that we should push forward. So lots more to be discussed, but that's it for today from us. Thank you all for joining the conversation, everybody here in the room for asking lots of interesting questions, and to the panelists for answering all of them. And I hand back to Anna.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Round of applause, everyone. Thank you so much. And those of you who joined us via Zoom, thanks so much for being in that space as well. So we will close up now and thank the Next Gen Cities Institute for making this panel and this conversation possible here today, especially during this week where we're all thinking about these questions, I think, quite I can't speak anymore, prominently. Sorry about that. I just wanted to remind you that we did stream this conversation on our YouTube channel, so if you'd like to revisit it or share it with colleagues, please check out Concordia University's Fourth Space on YouTube and you'll find it there. Okay, folks, until next time, we'll close up. Bye, everybody.